A reclusive millionaire, James Hunter, is haunted by the disappearance of his son, Jack, 7 years ago. His life takes a sudden turn when he crosses paths with Emily, a struggling single mother, and her adopted son who unknowingly wears a bracelet once belonging to Jack. James Hunter stared out of his office window, watching the city bustle below. It had been 7 years since his son, Jack, disappeared without a trace. 7 long years of cold, lonely nights, and an empty, hollow feeling that no amount of money could fill. James had poured himself into his work, building his tech empire, but no success could replace the ache left by Jack's absence. He'd become distant, avoiding any emotional connections, even as his wealth continued to grow. On the other side of town, Emily Evans hurried through the streets with her 2 children in tow. The weight of single motherhood pressed heavily on her shoulders. Balancing her job as a waitress with raising her kids, Noah and Lily, was a daily struggle. Noah, her oldest at 12, needed a laptop for school, and after months of saving, she finally had just enough to buy a used one. It wasn't much, but it was all she could afford. They entered Hunter Tech, one of James's smaller tech stores, known for offering second-hand devices at reasonable prices. As Emily approached the counter, her nerves kicked in. She wasn't sure how she'd explain to Noah that this old laptop was all they could manage. She glanced down at him, his hopeful eyes searching the store for something more. He deserved better. At the checkout, the cashier scanned the laptop. Emily's heart sank when the total flashed on the screen. It was more than expected. The savings she'd scrapped together wouldn't cover the additional cost. She fumbled with her wallet, her hands trembling. "Ma'am, if you can't pay for it, we'll have to ask you to step aside," the cashier said with a cold tone, drawing the attention of a few other customers. The embarrassment rose in Emily's throat, and she stammered an apology. Before she could turn to leave, a deep voice interrupted. "What's the problem here?" It was James Hunter himself, his tall figure looming near the entrance of the store. He had come in for a routine inspection, but something about this scene caught his attention. Emily looked up, startled, unsure of who this man was. The cashier explained the situation, clearly intimidated by his presence. James's gaze shifted from the cashier to the woman and her children. For a moment, his eyes softened. But then something caught his eye, a glint of metal on the boy's wrist. It was a small bracelet, simple, but unmistakable. His heart stopped. That bracelet. It had been Jack's, given to his son on his 5th birthday, the last birthday they celebrated together before his disappearance. James felt the air rush out of his lungs. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this boy, this stranger, be wearing something so personal? Clearing his throat, he stepped forward, his voice calm but strained. "Where did you get that bracelet?" he asked, his eyes now locked on Noah's wrist. Emily frowned, confused by his sudden interest in something so small. "The bracelet? It was with him when I adopted him from foster care. He's had it as long as I've known him." James felt the floor tilt beneath him. Foster care? Adoption? He took a step closer, his pulse quickening. "What's his name?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Emily hesitated, suddenly unsure if she should answer. "Noah. His name is Noah." James's eyes flicked back to the boy, and the memories surged back. The bracelet, the name Noah. None of it made sense, but it stirred something deep within him. He had to know more. James Hunter stood frozen, his mind swirling with memories of Jack, his missing son. Emily sensed the tension, clutching Noah's shoulder protectively. She had no idea why this stranger was so fixated on her son, and the way he looked at the bracelet made her uneasy. "You said he was adopted?" James asked, his voice tight as he tried to keep his emotions in check. Emily nodded cautiously. "Yes, from foster care. He came to me when he was about 3. There wasn't much information, just that he had been abandoned. The only thing he had with him was that bracelet." James struggled to maintain his composure. The bracelet was one of a kind, something he had designed for Jack himself. The thought of another child wearing it, his child, left him rattled, but he couldn't jump to conclusions, no matter how much he wanted to. "Do you know where he was before foster care? Any details?" James asked, trying to control his rising hope and fear. No, Emily admitted. There was no paperwork about his life before then, and Noah doesn't remember much, just bits and pieces, but nothing clear. James swallowed hard. He needed to be cautious, but the parallels were too much to ignore. A boy with Jack's bracelet, adopted, the right age. It felt like a sign. He took a breath, forcing himself to ask the next question. Did he ever mention another name? A different name, maybe? His voice wavered slightly, betraying his nerves. Emily blinked, surprised by the question. She thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. Actually, yes. He mentioned the name Jack a few times when he was younger. He used to say that was his name, but it was before he really understood everything. I always assumed it was a memory from before the foster system. James's breath caught in his throat. Jack. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Noah, who had been quiet, suddenly looked up at James. His gaze was curious but distant, like he was searching for something in the older man's face. I used to have another name, Noah said, his voice soft and unsure. But I don't remember all of it. James's heart pounded. His mind raced as he tried to piece it all together. 7 years ago, his son had vanished without a trace. Could it really be this simple? Could his son have ended up in foster care, adopted by a woman who had no idea of his past? His logical mind screamed that he needed more proof, but his heart, the part of him that had been broken for 7 long years, was already convinced. I need to know more, James said, his voice urgent now. He looked directly at Emily, who flinched under his intensity. Please, this is going to sound strange, but my son disappeared 7 years ago. His name was Jack. He was 5 years old when he went missing, and that bracelet, he pointed at Noah's wrist. I gave it to him on his birthday. It's one of a kind. Emily's eyes widened in shock. She glanced at Noah, who looked confused but intrigued. Are you saying Noah might be your son? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. James nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The weight of the possibility was too much to bear. He hadn't allowed himself to hope in so long, but now, faced with this boy and that bracelet, the floodgates opened. Emily looked at Noah, her thoughts racing. She could see the desperation in James's eyes, but it was hard to believe. She had raised Noah since he was a toddler. Could this billionaire really be his father? And what would that mean for them? I don't know what to say, Emily stammered, trying to make sense of everything. Noah doesn't remember much from before. He sometimes talks about a big house, but that's all I know. James's heart skipped a beat. A big house. It wasn't definitive, but it was something. His estate had been Noah's, Jack's, home for the first 5 years of his life. I have to be sure, James said, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. I need to know if he's my son. Please, let me help you. Let me help him. Emily hesitated. She didn't know what to think. The last thing she wanted was to disrupt Noah's life. But the way James spoke, the raw pain in his eyes, made her pause. He truly believed Noah could be Jack. And if it were true, how could she deny Noah his real family? I don't want to confuse him, Emily said cautiously. He's already been through so much. I know, James said softly. But if there's even a chance that he's Jack, I have to know. Noah tugged on Emily's sleeve, looking up at her with wide eyes. Who is this man, Mom? Why does he think I'm his son? Emily knelt down beside him, brushing his hair gently. I don't know, Noah. He thinks you might be someone very important to him, but we have to figure it out, okay? Noah nodded slowly, his young mind struggling to process the situation. He glanced back at James, studying the stranger's face, as if searching for some hidden connection. James watched the boy, his heart aching with the need for answers. He didn't want to push too hard, but he couldn't let this go. Not now. Would you come to my house? James asked, his voice tentative. Maybe if Noah sees it, maybe it will help him remember something. Emily hesitated, but the sincerity in James's voice gave her pause. She knew how much this meant to him, and deep down, she felt she owed it to Noah to find out the truth. All right, she agreed after a long pause. We'll go with you. But we have to be careful. Noah's been through enough already. James nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. I promise I won't do anything to hurt him. As they left the store together, a strange sense of destiny settled over them. James couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Could it really be his son, Jack? The drive to James Hunter's estate was tense and quiet. Emily sat beside Noah in the back seat of James's sleek black car, her mind racing. James, focused on the road, glanced at them through the rearview mirror from time to time, trying to make sense of the storm of emotions inside him. Noah, who usually chattered endlessly about school or his friends, sat quietly, his wide eyes absorbing everything. Emily hadn't anticipated her day taking this kind of turn. One moment, she was struggling to buy a used laptop, and the next, she was in a car with a billionaire who believed her son might be his long-lost child. It was all too surreal. James, on the other hand, was barely keeping his emotions in check. Every time he looked at Noah, memories of Jack surged forward. The boy had the same age, the same hair, the same bracelet. But that wasn't enough. He needed something more concrete. As they pulled up to the estate, Noah's eyes widened at the sight of the massive mansion that loomed ahead. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. An enormous house surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns, tall gates, and old oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Emily felt Noah's hand tighten around hers. "It's so big, Mom," he whispered, awe in his voice. James parked the car and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate, as if afraid of what might happen next. He led them toward the grand entrance, where the heavy wooden doors opened into a sprawling foyer. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and marble floors stretched before them, all gleaming in the afternoon light. As they entered, Noah looked around, his gaze lingering on the details. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring up at the high arches of the ceiling. There was a strange flicker of recognition in his eyes, as if something distant and forgotten was pushing its way to the surface. "I've been here before," Noah said softly, his voice echoing through the foyer. Emily stiffened at his words, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced at James, whose expression was unreadable. "Are you sure, Noah?" she asked gently, crouching down to meet his eyes. Noah nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the room. "It feels familiar, like I remember running around here. There was a big party once, I think, with balloons and cake." James's breath caught in his throat. Jack's 5th birthday party had been just like that, big, loud, filled with balloons and cake, with Jack running through the house with his friends. He could almost hear the laughter echoing in the halls again. Emily's stomach turned. This was no longer just a strange coincidence. Something about this house was sparking Noah's memories, and that scared her. Could he really be this man's missing son? She hadn't planned for this. She didn't know how to handle it. James knelt down beside Noah, trying to keep his voice steady. "What else do you remember, Noah?" Noah looked at him, his brow furrowed as he searched for more fragments of the past. "I remember a room with a lot of toys, and a picture on the wall of a man and a boy. The man had dark hair, like you." James blinked, his heart pounding. The room Noah was describing was Jack's old playroom, which hadn't been touched since the day Jack disappeared. And the picture? There had been a framed photograph of James and Jack in that room, one of the last photos taken of them together. His fingers trembled as he gestured for Emily and Noah to follow him. He led them up the wide staircase and down a long hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. Stopping at a door near the end of the corridor, James hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The room was exactly as it had been 7 years ago. Brightly colored walls, shelves lined with toys, and a small bed in the corner. And there, hanging on the wall, was the photograph Noah had mentioned. A younger James with Jack on his shoulders, both of them smiling and carefree. Noah stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. He walked over to the shelves, touching some of the toys as if they held distant memories. His fingers grazed a small wooden train, and he froze. "I remember this," he whispered, picking up the toy. "I played with this." James's vision blurred. It was too much, the bracelet, the memories, the recognition in Noah's eyes. But he needed more. He needed absolute proof. "Emily," James said, his voice strained, "we need to go further. I have to know for sure." Would you come with me to the adoption agency? Maybe they have more information, something that can explain how this happened. Emily bit her lip, anxiety gnawing at her. This was all spiraling out of control so fast. But how could she deny it now? The look on Noah's face, the way he connected with this place, it was undeniable. Okay, she said quietly. We'll go. The next day, they arrived at the adoption agency that had handled Noah's case. The old building felt cold and clinical, its gray walls adding to the weight of the situation. Inside, James and Emily explained their situation to the receptionist, who seemed skeptical at first. But after hearing James Hunter's name and the gravity of the matter, she agreed to let them speak to one of the caseworkers. A tired-looking woman in her 50s, Mrs. Chapman, led them to a small office cluttered with paperwork. She pulled up Noah's file, flipping through the sparse records. There's not much here, she said, her tone apologetic. Noah was left at a foster home with no identifying documents. Just the bracelet he was wearing. James leaned forward. Can I see the file? Mrs. Chapman hesitated before handing it over. James scanned the pages quickly, his heart sinking as he found little more than basic information about Noah's arrival at the foster home. Noah mentioned he remembers being called Jack, Emily added, her voice soft. And the bracelet, it's the same one that belonged to James's son. Mrs. Chapman's brow furrowed as she thought back. That bracelet. I do remember something about it. The foster family mentioned it when Noah was brought in. It's unique, not something you see every day. They said it was probably from his original family, but no one could trace where it came from. James's pulse quickened. Every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The bracelet, Noah's memories of the house, his recall of the name Jack. Everything was pointing in one direction. I need to know if Noah is my son, James said firmly. I need a DNA test. Emily tensed at the suggestion. She had raised Noah since he was 3. The thought of him being someone else's son, of sharing him with someone else, scared her more than she wanted to admit. But for Noah's sake, she had to put her fears aside. If that's what it takes, Emily said quietly, looking at James, we'll do the test. The next few days were a blur of tension and anxiety. The DNA test was done, and all they could do now was wait. Emily felt like she was holding her breath the entire time, every second dragging on endlessly. James barely slept, consumed by thoughts of what the results might reveal. If Noah truly was Jack, it would mean the end of 7 years of uncertainty and heartache. But what if he wasn't? What if this was all just a painful coincidence? And then, the day came. James received a call from the lab. His hands trembled as he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes? On the other end, the voice was calm but definitive. The test results came back positive. Noah is your son. James felt the world tilt beneath him as relief, joy, and overwhelming emotions surged through him. Noah was Jack. His Jack? His son had been found. James Hunter sat in stunned silence, his phone still in hand as the words echoed in his mind. Noah is your son. It didn't seem real. 7 years of pain, longing, and unanswered questions, all leading to this moment. He was staring at the answer he had prayed for but never truly believed would come. His son, Jack, was alive. He stood in the middle of his office, lost in thought, when Emily and Noah entered. Emily immediately sensed that something had changed. The tension in the room was palpable, and James's expression was unreadable, almost fragile. Did you get the results? Emily asked softly, her voice tight with anticipation. Her heart pounded in her chest as she braced for the answer. She wasn't sure if she wanted it to be true or false anymore. The thought of Noah being someone else's son, even if it meant reuniting him with his real father, terrified her. James nodded slowly, his eyes locking with Emily's. It's him, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Noah is Jack. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She felt her knees weaken as the reality of it hit her. All this time, the child she had loved, raised, and protected wasn't just an orphan in need of a home. He was the son of a billionaire, a boy who had been stolen from a life she couldn't even imagine. Noah, who had been sitting quietly, looked between James and his mother, confusion etched on his face. What do you mean? I'm Jack, he asked, frowning. Mom, What's going on?" Emily knelt down in front of him, tears welling in her eyes. How could she explain this to him? How could she tell him that everything he knew about himself was about to change? She reached for his hands, holding them tightly. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice trembling, "this man, James, he's your biological father. When you were little, you were taken from him, kidnapped. Your real name isn't Noah, it's Jack." Noah blinked, his young mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what he was hearing. "So, you're not my mom?" Emily's heart shattered at the question. She felt tears slide down her cheeks as she cupped his face gently. "No, baby, I'm your mom," she said firmly. "I've always been your mom, and I always will be. Nothing will change that. But you also have a dad who has been looking for you for a long time." Noah glanced over at James, who was standing awkwardly, his emotions barely contained. He wasn't sure how to approach this moment, how to express the torrent of feelings he had suppressed for so long. "You're really my dad?" Noah asked, his voice uncertain. James nodded, stepping forward, kneeling to meet Noah at eye level. His eyes were full of tears, but he smiled softly. "Yeah, buddy, I'm your dad, and I've missed you every single day." Noah stared at him for a long moment, taking in his face, the raw emotion in his eyes, the sincerity in his words. Slowly, he reached out his hand, and James took it, his grip firm but gentle. For James, it was like grasping a lifeline he thought he had lost forever. Over the next few days, the news spread quickly. James Hunter, the reclusive billionaire, had found his long-lost son. The media descended on the story like vultures, but James kept the details private, shielding Noah and Emily from the public eye as much as possible. Inside the mansion, however, things were far from simple. Emily was overwhelmed, struggling to come to terms with the DNA results. She had always known that Noah's past was a mystery, but she never expected that the truth would lead her into the orbit of a billionaire. The question that weighed on her most was simple yet devastating. What happens now? In the midst of this emotional storm, Noah was having his own crisis. At 12 years old, he was barely beginning to understand who he was, and now, everything he thought he knew was being questioned. He tried to process the fact that he had another family, one he didn't remember, the mansion, the wealth, the father he had forgotten. It was all too much for him. "Mom," Noah asked one night as they sat together in the guest room James had given them, "what happens now? Am I supposed to live here? Is Mr. Hunter my dad now?" Emily's heart ached at the confusion in his voice. She took a deep breath, struggling with how to answer. "Noah, I don't know what the future holds. But what I do know is that I love you, and that's never going to change. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. You're not alone in this." Noah nodded, though his worry didn't entirely fade. "But what about him? What if he wants me to live here, like I'm supposed to?" Emily bit her lip. That was the question she feared most. What if James wanted Noah to stay with him? What if he wanted to take him away? Meanwhile, James was wrestling with his own thoughts in the quiet solitude of his study. He had spent the last 7 years haunted by the memory of his son, and now that Noah, Jack, had been found, everything was supposed to be better. But it wasn't that simple. He had thought the hardest part was finding Jack, but now he was faced with the complexities of rebuilding a relationship with a boy who had no memory of him. The connection wasn't automatic. It was like trying to bridge two worlds, his life of wealth and privilege, and Emily and Noah's more modest, close-knit world. He wanted to be part of his son's life, but how? Noah barely knew him, and Emily, she had raised him. She was his mother in every way that mattered. James's mind raced with possibilities. Could they co-parent? Would Noah choose to stay with him, or would he remain with Emily? Would he even have a choice? James picked up the phone, dialing his lawyer, who had been working on reopening the case of Jack's disappearance. The police had immediately reclassified the case as a kidnapping now that Jack had been found. They were closing in on the man responsible, Victor Hale, a former friend of James who had harbored deep resentment toward him. Victor had once been James's business partner, but after a falling out, their friendship had dissolved into bitterness. The police believed Victor had orchestrated Jack's abduction as a twisted form of revenge, hoping to shatter James's life and career. And it had worked. James had never recovered emotionally. But now, the pieces were falling into place. That evening, Emily found James sitting alone in the study, staring out the window, lost in thought. She hesitated before stepping inside, her hands fidgeting nervously. "James," she said softly, and he turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "I don't know what to do," Emily admitted, sitting down across from him. "I don't know how we're supposed to move forward from here. I don't want to lose Noah, but I don't want to take him away from you either." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't want to take him away from you, Emily. I just want to be part of his life. I missed out on so much already. I don't want to miss any more." Emily nodded, understanding his pain all too well. "Then we need to figure out how to do this together. Co-parenting, or whatever this becomes. We can't confuse Noah more than he already is." James looked at her, grateful for her openness. He had feared she might pull away, that she would take Noah and disappear. But here she was, willing to work with him, to give him the chance to be a father again. "I think we can make this work," James said softly, "for Noah's sake. But it's going to be complicated." Emily smiled faintly, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Yeah, complicated seems like an understatement." As they sat there, the enormity of the task before them began to settle in. Reuniting James with his son had been just the first step. Now, they had to navigate the delicate process of building a life together, for Noah's sake. The boy would have two parents in his life, one who had loved him from afar, and one who had been there through everything. And just as James and Emily began to find common ground, the investigation into Jack's kidnapping was heating up. Victor Hale had resurfaced, and the truth about Jack's disappearance was about to be unveiled, threatening to upend everything once again. The days following the DNA confirmation were a whirlwind for James, Emily, and Noah. The emotional weight of their new reality loomed large, and just as they began settling into a fragile routine, the investigation into Jack's disappearance took a sudden, dramatic turn. James had always known there was something sinister about Jack's kidnapping. The police had worked tirelessly back then, but every lead had gone cold. Now, with Jack, Noah, found, the authorities were finally zeroing in on someone. Victor Hale, James's former business partner and once close friend. James had long suspected Victor, though there had never been enough evidence to prove it. Their fallout years ago had been bitter, but he hadn't realized just how far Victor's envy had driven him. Now, with the police reopening the case, the pieces were falling into place. The man who had once been like a brother to him had orchestrated the worst tragedy of his life. It was early one morning when the call came from the police detective working on the case. James, already anxious, picked up his phone immediately, his pulse racing. "Mr. Hunter, we've found something," the detective said. "Victor Hale has been taken into custody. He's confessed." James's grip tightened around the phone. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He claims he orchestrated the abduction. From what we've gathered, Victor felt overshadowed by your success and harbored a deep resentment toward you. He wanted to hurt you in the worst way possible. According to his confession, he hired people to take Jack, intending to make you suffer emotionally and ruin you professionally. After Jack was taken, Victor lost control of the situation. He hadn't anticipated how things would spiral." James's mind reeled as he tried to process the detective's words. "Where was Jack taken?" he asked, his throat dry. "We believe Jack was moved through several foster homes without Victor's direct involvement. He claims he had no intention of Jack ending up in the system, but the people he hired abandoned the plan. Jack, or Noah as he's known now, ended up in foster care as a result." The detective paused, then added, "We've gathered enough evidence to press charges against him for kidnapping and conspiracy. He's facing serious time in prison." James hung up the phone in a daze, anger, relief, and grief warring within him. Victor's confession felt like both a closure and a reopening of old wounds. His son's life had been stolen from him, not by random chance, but by someone who had once been close to him, a man he had trusted. The betrayal cut deep. Emily entered the room, noticing James's pale face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." James looked at her, struggling to find the words. "It's Victor," he said finally. "He confessed to everything." Emily's eyes widened. "Victor Hale? Your old business partner?" James nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "He was behind Jack's kidnapping. He did it out of spite, to hurt me. He had Jack taken, and then he lost control of the whole thing. That's how Jack ended up in foster care." Emily gasped, her hand instinctively moving to cover her mouth. "My God. So, all this time, it wasn't just a random tragedy?" "No," James said bitterly. "It was a calculated act of cruelty." He turned toward the window, staring out at the sprawling estate that had once been his family's haven. "He wanted to destroy me, and he almost did." Emily placed a gentle hand on James's arm, offering comfort. "What happens now? Will he go to prison?" James nodded. "The police have enough evidence to put him away for a long time, but it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't give Jack back the years he lost." Emily sat down beside him, her heart aching for him and for Noah. "No," she said softly, "but at least now you know the truth. And Noah, he's here. He's alive, James. That's what matters now." James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He turned to Emily, his expression vulnerable. "What if Noah resents me for what happened? What if he blames me for everything?" Emily shook her head, her eyes filled with empathy. "Noah doesn't blame you. He's confused, yes, but he's a good kid. He just needs time. We all need time to heal." That evening, as the sun set over the estate, James, Emily, and Noah sat together in the garden, trying to navigate the complex web of emotions that had come with the truth. Noah had been quieter than usual, his young mind struggling to make sense of the past. "Mom," Noah said quietly, breaking the silence, "why did that man take me? Why did he want to hurt Dad?" Emily looked at him, her heart breaking for her son. "Sometimes, people do terrible things because they're angry or jealous, and they don't think about the pain they're causing." James leaned forward, his voice filled with regret. "Noah, I'm so sorry this happened to you. If I could take it all back, I would. I never wanted you to go through any of this." Noah looked at him, his expression conflicted. "I don't really remember any of it," he admitted. "I just remember being scared sometimes, but I don't know why." James's heart clenched at his son's words. He wanted so badly to make up for the lost years, to protect Noah from any more pain. But he knew that no amount of money or power could erase the past. "I know this is hard," James said softly, "but I want you to know that I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together, okay?" Noah nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between James and Emily. I'm not sure who I am anymore," he confessed. "I thought I was Noah, but now I'm Jack too. I don't know how to be both." Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to choose, sweetheart. You're still you. Whether you're called Noah or Jack, you're the same boy we love." James smiled softly, his eyes filled with pride. "Emily's right. You don't have to figure everything out right now. Just take your time. We're both here for you." Noah smiled faintly, comforted by their words, though the weight of his identity still pressed on him. He was a boy with 2 names, 2 lives, and 2 parents who loved him. But reconciling all those pieces would take time. A few days later, the trial against Victor Hale began. James and Emily chose to keep Noah out of the courtroom, wanting to protect him from the ugly details. Victor pleaded guilty to the charges, his confession sealing his fate. He admitted to orchestrating Jack's abduction as a twisted form of revenge, though he claimed to have lost control of the situation when the people he hired abandoned Jack in the foster system. Victor showed no real remorse during the trial, his bitterness toward James still simmering beneath the surface. But none of that mattered now. Justice was finally being served, and Victor Hale would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For James, the trial offered some closure, but the scars of what Victor had done would remain. He had lost 7 years with his son, years he could never get back, but he was determined to make the most of the future. Noah was here, and that was all that mattered now. That evening, after the trial had concluded, James, Emily, and Noah gathered together for a quiet dinner. There were no reporters, no questions from the outside world, just the 3 of them trying to piece together the fragments of their lives. As they sat around the table, Noah looked up at his parents, a new sense of calm settling over him. "So, what happens now?" James smiled softly, glancing at Emily before turning back to his son. "Now, we move forward," he said simply. "Together." Noah smiled, the weight on his shoulders lifting just a little. There was still so much to figure out, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't lost anymore. He had his mom, his dad, and the promise of a future built on love, not loss. And that, for now, was enough. The day after the trial ended, the air felt lighter around the Hunter estate. With Victor Hale sentenced to life in prison, a heavy weight had been lifted. For the first time in 7 years, James Hunter could breathe, knowing that the man who had torn his world apart was gone for good. But despite this closure, there was still so much to repair, especially in Noah's life. Several weeks passed, and the once tense household began to settle into a rhythm. Noah, now understanding that he was both Noah and Jack, was slowly learning to navigate his dual identity. He continued calling himself Noah at school and with his friends, but around James, he allowed himself to respond to Jack. The memories of his early childhood were returning in small flashes, nothing vivid, but enough to make him feel connected to his past life. Emily had been watching the transformation unfold with mixed emotions. While she was relieved that Noah had embraced his new reality, she couldn't help but feel anxious. She had always been his world, his protector, but now she shared that role with James. It was a strange, bittersweet transition. One morning, as she sat on the terrace with a cup of coffee, James joined her. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was an unspoken understanding that they needed to talk. "How's he doing?" James asked, nodding toward the garden where Noah was kicking a soccer ball around. Emily smiled softly, watching her son. "Better. He seems happier, more relaxed. I think having both of us here for him helps." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I was worried about that. I didn't want to overwhelm him or make him feel like he had to choose between us." Emily looked at him, appreciating his honesty. "You've been good with him, James. I know this isn't easy for either of us, but you're a great dad. I can see how much he's starting to trust you." James's face softened at the compliment. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time. I know I can't get those years back, but I want to be here for him now." Emily reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "We're doing this together. You don't have to carry that burden alone." James smiled, grateful for her support. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but they were making it work, slowly but surely. That evening, they held a small, private ceremony in the garden to honor Jack's lost childhood. It was Emily's idea, a way to acknowledge the years Noah had spent not knowing who he was and to symbolically close that chapter of his life. The ceremony wasn't about mourning what was lost, but about celebrating the family they had found in each other. Noah sat between James and Emily, holding their hands as they lit a single candle in the center of the garden. The flickering flame cast a warm glow over their faces as the sun set behind the trees. "I don't remember a lot from when I was Jack," Noah said quietly, staring at the candle. "But I know I wasn't scared when I was with you, Dad. I remember feeling happy." James's throat tightened with emotion, and he squeezed Noah's hand gently. "You were always brave, even as a little boy. I'm so proud of you, Noah." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. She leaned over, kissing the top of Noah's head. "You're an incredible kid, Noah. We're so lucky to have you." Noah looked between his parents, a shy smile forming on his lips. "I'm lucky too." They sat in silence for a few more moments, letting the warmth of their bond wash over them. There was still much to process, much to heal, but for the first time, they felt like a true family. In the weeks that followed, they began to find their footing in their new lives. James, determined to be a present father, took time away from his business to spend with Noah. They played soccer in the garden, went fishing at the nearby lake, and even built a treehouse together, a project that brought both of them closer. Emily, too, found a new sense of peace. While the future still felt uncertain, she was no longer carrying the weight of Noah's past alone. She had always been strong, but now she had James to share that strength with. Their co-parenting arrangement was unconventional, but it worked. They had become a team. Noah, for his part, was thriving. His schoolwork improved, his friendships deepened, and his anxiety over his identity slowly faded. He embraced the love of both his parents, feeling secure in the knowledge that he didn't have to choose between them. One day, as they all sat together for dinner, Noah looked up from his plate and smiled. "I like it when we're all together," he said. James and Emily exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with pride. "We like it too," James said, his voice filled with warmth. "We're a team now, right?" Noah grinned, nodding. "Yeah, a team." As the months passed, life returned to a new normal. James's estate, once a symbol of loneliness and loss, became a home filled with laughter and love. Emily and Noah spent weekends there, sharing meals and creating new memories. The mansion, with its grand halls and sprawling grounds, no longer felt cold. It was alive again, full of the warmth of family. Though the pain of the past would never fully disappear, they had found a way to move forward, together. They didn't need to forget what had been lost, but they also didn't let it define them. Victor Hale's betrayal, the years of searching, the trauma of Jack's kidnapping. All of it was now part of their history, but not their future. Their future was about healing, about building a life together, and about love. And so, as the days stretched into years, James, Emily, and Noah carved out a new path. One where they could honor the past while embracing the hope of tomorrow. In the end, it wasn't about wealth or power, or even the scars of loss. It was about family, the one they had found, and the one they had built together. For Noah, James, and Emily, their story was just beginning.